consider it properly. I'm going to record because somebody asked that we try to record it on cassette, and I don't know how it'll turn out. We'll just see. But let's go ahead and pray just a minute as we begin. Holy Father, I know that none of us is worthy. You told Moses to take his shoes from off his feet because the place whereon he stood was holy ground. And John fell at the feet of Jesus as one dead, and Simon said, "Depart from me, O Lord, for I'm a sinful man." And Daniel said, "When I beheld the Ancient of Days, my very beauty was turned into me unto corruption, and I had no comeliness." And in comparison to what we know to be true of you, what little we know, and what we see in the lives of other people, we realize how unholy we are. And we submit ourselves to you tonight as we begin in an opening session to look into the progress of a Christian pilgrim and through all the agonies and dimensions of everything it took for him to make the journey all the way home. I pray that you will teach us like you taught John Bunyan, and do in us what you did in him, and still our hearts and stifle the flesh, and grant that Jesus might be seen clearly by us as we open this document and begin our study of it, and however much we're in it from time to time. I pray that you preside over every session and make us teachable. May we hear Jesus saying, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for my yoke is easy, my burden is light. I am meek and lowly in heart." Would you grant us that spirit as we yoke up with him as we pass through this book together? I trust you for this and pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Now take the sheet of your timeline and turn to the side that says Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan at the top of the page. What you've got here on the front side, on that part of the sheet, you've got a timeline of the history of Bunyan. It doesn't have all the main events in it. In fact, there are one or two I left out that I wish I had not left out, but I didn't notice that I'd left them out when I wrote this out. Just look at them, and we'll move quickly because we'll run out of time if we get anchored here in history. This is not a course on history, but it should be, because you can't go wrong looking back into these things. It takes us back into the middle of the 16th century, and the first date on there is 1564, when the word Puritan became a current word in the English language in England. And the word Puritan, actually, it's the picture of a theological conservative, and they formed also the biggest part of a very strong political party, exercising their voice in spiritual Christian theological conservatism. And so you could say, except for the bad side that we think of, the Puritans of that day were the Pharisees, except for the bad side. See, you'd never convince anybody in Jesus' day that the Pharisees were bad people. That's an idea that's come out of that because of what we know of their pride. But the Puritans were extremely, extremely committed people. And the issue that caused the trouble for the Puritans was that conformity to the Church of England was being enforced, and they were radical Protestants. And conformity to the Church of England meant that you had to worship according to the dictate that the law of the state, that is the law of the Church of England, dictated. And they would not do it. And so they were Protestants in the classic sense of the word. They protested against conformity to the worship and form of the Church of England. And that word became popularized, currently used widely, in 1564 in England. Then in 1611, the King James Version was published. So this will set it in some frame of reference. In 1616, Shakespeare died, and his plays had already become very, very popular by the time he died. So he was well known when he died. And his plays were being played and shown everywhere. In 1620, to put it in the American frame of reference, the Pilgrims, that is, those who came to this country in its early inception, before its actual historical beginning, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Bay in the Americas in 1620. In 1628, and this will give you the frame of reference, John Bunyan was born in a little village named Esto, which now is wall to wall. Actually, only the boundary line separates the village of Esto from Bedford, England today, but then they were much smaller and there was space between them. Now, in order to get that historical reference, notice what happened that same year Bunyan was born. The same year Bunyan was born, John Milton, any literary student knows him, any Christian ought to know him. The tragedy is these things have been left on the shelf. John Milton was a third-year student at Christ's College in Cambridge, which bred educationally many, well, almost all of the educated Puritan voices of England of that day came out of Christ's College in Cambridge. And the year Bunyan was born, John Milton, we'll come back to that later, was a third-year student at Christ's College in Cambridge. The same year, anybody with a sense of history will really appreciate this, the man who was known as the Protector of England, a radical Protestant, Oliver Cromwell, entered the British Parliament. Boy, there was conflict everywhere because of the tension between Catholicism, the Church of England, and radical Protestantism such as the Puritans represented. Bunyan's father called himself a brazier. Means a village blacksmith, and he also sharpened knives and other household instruments. And Bunyan gained this from his father. He became a tinker. Someone called him a tinker turned thinker. Or is that a description? A tinker is a person who makes and mends pots and pans and skillets and things like that. And he also sharpened household implements, things of that nature. Now, I want you to keep that in mind because there's something in the very opening picture in Pilgrim's Progress you won't recognize it unless you're thinking carefully, but I'll try to point out when we get there. Now, here's a conflict. Bunyan's own father was a member of the Church of England and a loyalist to the state and the church. And Bunyan broke with that upon his conversion. 1649, when he was 21 years of age, Bunyan married for the first time. Some short years later, 6 years later, his wife died. His wife was an incredible inspiration to him. In fact, both wives he had were incredible supports and illustrations to him. He married again not too long after his first wife died. In 1655, 6 years after he married her, his wife died, leaving him with 4 small children. The mortality rate in England at the time was very questionable, very vulnerable, and she was victimized there. She died fairly young. In 1660, he was cast into prison. He was 32 years of age. Now, let me tell you what happened. When he was saved at 25 years old. About 3 years or less later, he started preaching, and it became very evident from the very beginning that he was a very perceptive, spiritually sensitive, insightful man, and he had tremendous gospel communicating capability. And so he started preaching 3 years after he was saved, and then 6 years later, roughly 6 years later, he was put in prison for the first time. And he was imprisoned because of his deep convictions against the formalism and side-door Catholicism of the Church of England. And he preached and held assembly in defiance of the Church of England, and so they put him in jail. And he spent a total, with interruptions, but the total number of years in jail was 12 years. And out of it came 6 of the greatest books ever written, and this is probably the second greatest book ever written, Pilgrim's Progress. It's certainly the second greatest Christian book on the market, but it's almost lost today for a lot of reasons. In fact, you can mark down the date 1870 in your notes. I think that's somewhere in here. Yeah, Dan, but don't turn that page over yet. In 1870, America put Pilgrim's Progress on the shelf. That's where America's decline began. In 1870, all the way back to there. It was steady, progressive, but it wasn't extremely noticeable at the beginning. And so he was cast into prison the first time in 1660. In 1666, he published his autobiography, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. Now, I wish I had time to talk about that. I taught this in my last church to a small group of men, and probably the leading man in the church, the most articulate and most widely read man in the church. He took it privately and read it and came to these groups and where I taught it. And when we finished, here's what he said. He said, Brother Herb, that book ought to be required reading, if there were a possible way to do it, for every Christian in the English-speaking world. Now, you won't hear that. Yeah, I promise you won't hear that. You won't do a thing about that. You'll live and die losing, because the greatest literature ever written you'll leave on the shelf and go for some super popular thing today that won't minister to you like any of these will minister to you. I went and bought another copy today of Grace Abounding. I got it on sale. I couldn't believe it. Nobody wants it apparently. But I want to tell you, to lose these things is to lose heaven. I mean, just ask God what he thinks about it. Look how he's endorsed it. Now, the same year that he published his autobiography, Newton discovered the law of gravity, or the law of gravitation. You know that story about the apple falling on his head and so forth. Well, that happened in 1666. And in 1667, John Milton's Paradise Lost was published, one of the greatest documents. Now, I would not recommend that anybody try to read that. It's just much, much too hard. It's impossible. It's so poetic that you get lost in the flow of the language, but it has incredible insights in it. If a person could work his way through it. Now, I'm going to say something to you. I don't know whether you can hear or not. I'm just going to take a chance with you. If you were to put together all the writings of Aurelius Augustine, probably the greatest theologian in the history of the church, Thomas Aquinas, Jonathan Edwards, John Calvin, Martin Luther, put them all together and master them, you would get no better theological education than you'll get in Pilgrim's Progress. Now, there's no way you can appreciate that. Because I just told you, if you read all the theological works in the world, you will not get any better education than those. If you put them all together, then you'll get in Pilgrim's Progress. I'm telling you, this is a master book. You'll begin to get a taste of it tonight. In 1678, in his last trip to the jail, he published Pilgrim's Progress. And that's the same time La Salle was exploring the Great Lakes here in this country. And then Bunyan died in 1688. Now turn the sheet over. We'll look a little bit about the book, about the man, and a little bit about the book. Bunyan, of course, was a Puritan. That means a theological conservative, a Protestant, a separatist. And originally, he didn't want to leave the Church of England. He wanted to purify it from the inside. In other words, he wanted to lead it to doctrinal and formal reform. That is, reform of worship. It's form of worship because it had in it, it brought over from Catholicism many of the abuses of Catholicism. And he didn't want to leave the church at the beginning. He wanted to reform it from within, but he found out it wouldn't work. Now, Brother Denny has just seen Luther, the film, and that's precisely the condition of Luther. He did not want to leave the Catholic Church when he started the reform. He wanted to reform it from the inside, but he found out it was totally incompatible with what he believed, and they actually got rid of him. I'm not sure he would have formally left had they not gotten rid of him.
The Lutheran Church would get rid of him today.
Well, a lot of things are happening today. Now, let me tell you in advance, Bunyan's favorite book outside the Bible was Luther's commentary on Galatians. He said, the greatest help on earth outside the Bible anybody can get if he's suffering from conviction of sin and needs to see the way to God would be Luther's commentary on Galatians. It was while a guy was reading the introduction to Luther's commentary on Romans that John Wesley was saved. I'm telling you, God's endorsement is on these things. We've done ourselves a desperate disfavor when we put them on the shelf. So he wanted to purify the Church of England from the inside. The American Pilgrims were universally Puritans. So our founding fathers were of similar persuasion to John Bunyan. Number two, he was also a Calvinist. Now, I think there's a little bit of weakness in one of his points of Calvinism, some things he views. You'll see it in the book. But Calvinism, to make it very simple, and Calvinism is much more technical than this, it's much more radical in what I'm going to sound like. But Calvinism essentially says, if you put it in a line, that salvation is all of God. That it does not wait on man's decision, that God orchestrates it, period. In other words, if God does not awaken the person, he can't be saved. If God does not graciously save him, he won't be saved. If God doesn't keep him saved, he won't stay saved. None of it depends on man. It all depends on God. That's what salvation by grace means. And examples of Calvinistic doctrine are, Calvinists believe in the absolute total depravity of man. They believe in the absolute sovereignty of God. They believe that God is the author and finisher of salvation. That is, salvation is not a cooperative venture between God and man. It's all of God. Now that's Calvinism. We're not here to argue any of those points, or just to say that's what it is. And that is essentially what he was, although I think you'll see some weaknesses in the book and raise some questions at some point if you know what to look for. This book is an allegory. That means it's a similitude. Whatever it says is similar to a truth beyond what it says, or it is a constant, unending comparison with hidden messages in every inflection. Now, there's one example of an allegory in the Bible, and most people don't even study it because it looks so threatening, but is it a gold mine? It's found in the last verses of Galatians chapter 4, which says these things are an allegory of Hagar and Sarah. Those are treated as allegorical characters. So Paul traces an allegory where everything about Hagar that's pointed out represents something in the spiritual life, and everything about Sarah that's pointed out represents something, item by item in the spiritual life. It's a classic description. And this book, Pilgrim's Progress, described the life of a Christian from the city of destruction all the way to the celestial city. The city of destruction represents this godless world. The celestial city, of course, represents heaven. Now, the message of this book will have almost no appeal to the carnal, natural mind that prevails in our society today. In fact, they will avoid it because it tells them the truth. And it's amazing how many people don't go to church because they're afraid of the truth they're going to hear in church. As if you could hide from God by not going to church. Now, what accounts for the success of Pilgrim's Progress? Well, number one, and boy, this is an understatement, it was perfectly true to the Bible. Charles Spurgeon said, "Prick Bunyan anywhere and he will bleed Bible. His blood is bibline." Let me say that again. Spurgeon said, "Prick Bunyan anywhere and he will bleed Bible." Now, you haven't heard the punchline yet about Spurgeon. See, everybody looks across the centuries and says, well, he was a gifted man. Well, he was a gifted man. But that wasn't the secret of his success. God can bypass gifts real easily. Here's the second reason for its success. It was true to genuine Christian experience. You'll see yourself so clearly pictured in this book, it's like a mirror. And anytime he introduces a character by name, you'll feel like you know the character when you hear his name, because his name is such a vivid picture of his character. And his characters, here's the third reason for it, are real characters. The only one I know that creates characters like Bunyan did, anywhere near that, is Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens' characters are buffoon characters. You hear their name, and you can tell what's going to be said about them, but he does a masterpiece of a job describing them. Mark Twain said, "I didn't meet anyone in all of my world travels whom I had not already met in Hannibal, Missouri." In other words, if a man really studies human character, he'll see everybody in his own community, because we're all the same. It's just a bit difference in degree, not a difference in kind. See, so the character of the characters of Pilgrim's Progress are all fundamental in form. In other words, when you see one, you've seen that kind of person vividly pictured. You'll have an example of that maybe. We'll meet at least the main character tonight, however far we get. And I hope we can get to a second character in the story before we finish tonight. Now, in the influence of the book, it'd be impossible to print on these two sheets anything near the influence. Spurgeon read Pilgrim's Progress over 100 times. And he only lived to be 58 years old. That's an average when he started reading it twice a year. And his sermons are absolute masterpieces, and they are compendiums of discussion of Pilgrim's Progress. Hawthorne, listen to this, perhaps the greatest American writer, style-wise, Hawthorne walked the Adirondack Mountains and the territory around Salem, Massachusetts during his entire youthful years, well up into his 20s. And they said everybody thought, they teased, that Pilgrim's Progress was a part of his anatomy, because everywhere he went with it open, reading it on the streets everywhere. As far as we know, Hawthorne never became a Christian, but he's haunted. The central figure in Hawthorne's writings is the ignorance of Pilgrim's Progress, the man named Ignorance. And if you want a short version of Pilgrim's Progress, read Hawthorne's The Celestial Railroad. It's the picture of Pilgrim in terms of a traveler on a railroad, not a person walking a pathway. Read The Celestial Railroad. And it is a masterpiece of echoing what this book says in a more popularized, modernized, for his day, modernized way. And Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. See, America has lost these gems because we don't have any taste for anything like this anymore. We've cultivated such carnal taste that these things look tame to us now. But these are masterpiece documents. Little Women is saturated. In fact, it's saturated with Christian values. If you get the movie, you'll see that even it is saturated to this late date with overt Christian values, because you can't translate the book on the film without translating something of Christianity on the film. Very important things. But in 1870, the influence of Pilgrim's Progress in America began to decline. And it began to decline coincidentally with the publication of Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad, which is a precise opposite book to Pilgrim's Progress. It's raucous, it's very irreverent, its humor is at the expense of God and righteousness and truth, and the American mind began to gravitate in that direction, and so we put Pilgrim's Progress on the shelf, and we've been going like a toboggan run downhill ever since. Now let's turn to the book. So open to page 1. If you've got an author's apology in the book, then you need to go past that. We're not going to even look at that. If you want to read that, you can read it on your own. It's not a part of the body of the book. It should open with the statement, The Pilgrim's Progress, Part 1. And we're just going to read and interpret a little bit as we go along, and I hope you'll take some notes as we go along, because there's some massive things in here. I think we mentioned this when we read the opening paragraph before, but we didn't say much about it. In the opening sentence, before you get to the comma, the part of the sentence before the comma, you see three words that begin with the letter W. And there are two ideas that form two giant burden ideas of this book. The first one is where the title comes from, Pilgrim. It's the word walked. It says, as I walked through the wilderness of this world. Now notice two things. Notice that he's a pilgrim. He's going all the way through the wilderness. And notice what he thinks of the world. He thinks of it as a wilderness. Now this is the way God thinks of it. This is the way a wise Christian will think of it. In other words, the world is no friend of grace. It never has been. It's what crucified Jesus. And the book is very clear about what we're supposed to do with regard to the world. In fact, put this in your notes and study it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we have the best balanced picture in the Bible of what we're to do with the world. I believe it's verse 31, but I'm not sure. That'll get you close to it. Here's what it says. We are to use the world without abusing it. Now think of that carefully. The abuse of it would be to become worldly. The use of it is to get whatever material resources you need from it, and then use those material resources to minister. And do not put down an anchor in this world where you can't leave. One wise Christian woman said, I wear this world like a loose garment because I can put it off at any time. Now, a pilgrim invariably will ask, in fact, let me ask this question. How many people on earth today are pilgrims?
Actually, everyone.
Everyone. Every last one is a pilgrim. He's on his way somewhere and he's passing through. The problem is there's not much pilgrim mentality. We're trying to anchor ourselves here. Now, pilgrim mentality requires the answer to three questions. Number one, where did I come from? What is my point of origin? And what is my point of origin spiritually? Am I in the shape I was created to be in? Or has something gone wrong? What is my point of origin morally? Am I in the right family? Where did I come from? That's where conviction begins. You begin to see there's something out of sorts. All right, the second pilgrim question is, why am I here? So the first question is a question concerning origin. The second one is a question concerning purpose. Why am I here? The third one is, where am I going? And notice he's very clear in the fourth word of the book. He's walking through. So he's going somewhere. He's going to fall out on the far side of the wilderness in some final destination. That's exactly the case with every man. Once you start to live, you start to live forever. And you cannot stop living once you have begun living, because you, like God, are eternal. He took you into his eternality the moment he gave you human existence. Unlike anything else God made, man has the mark of immortality upon him conferred by God. So there's that word walked. Now, because it's very difficult for us to picture this world as a wilderness. I mean, we look at the technological advances. Do you realize God is not in the least bit impressed with our technological advances? He's not in the least bit impressed with the things we have such a taste for, our comforts, our conveniences. And I wish we had time to talk about that, about what God is likely to do if we're overly impressed by those things. But now, because we can't see this, George, come get this, pass that around, because it's hard for us to realize that's what a real wilderness looks like. This is somebody's picture that's based on Pilgrim's Progress. And In other words, it's a place of complete desolation. There are no resources to be found for the good of the person anywhere in that wilderness. And
Brother
that's
Herb?
the way the world looks to God, and that's the way it's supposed to look to us. Yes, sir.
I just say, I'm going to say, I always thought wilderness was like a bunch of trees, like
Yeah.
forest, a dense forest.
It may be.
Till I mean, when I read the scripture, I always assumed
So
till we went to Israel,
you saw the south.
and then around Jericho where the wilderness is.
The wilderness of
I never
Judea.
realized that's it. I mean, that's a good picture of it. It's nothing. I mean,
It's
there
totally
was
barren,
nothing.
blistering heat with no vegetation and quick dehydration.
Yeah.
You realize Bishop Pike died of dehydration in that wilderness in 6 hours,
No doubt.
and he had a bottle of water with
Get
him.
up to 100 degrees and
He died in 6 hours of dehydration in that wilderness. So here's the picture of the book. As I walked through the wilderness of this world, I lighted on a certain place where was a den. Now the den is the Bedford jail. The den is the jail where they put him and kept him off and on for a total of 12 years. Now, please understand that I'm not saying there was a 12-year period in which he was in prison. I'm saying he was in prison for a total of 12 years, although they were intermittent. In other words, the total time he spent in jail was 12 years. And he was jailed for nonconformity. And he wrote out of that, what he calls the den here, the Bedford jail, he wrote at least 6 major useful works. And this is the best known. Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners is the second best known. And they are equally, absolutely marvelous documents. And I've got all those that came out of his writings from Bedford jail, and they are masterpieces. Now, learn a devotional lesson, 2 or 3 devotional lessons here. You see here the profitable use of evil circumstances. What would you do and think and say if you were put in jail? Here's a man who never soured or despaired, and he learned his greatest divine lessons with a Bible in his hand in 12 years in jail. So here's a lesson on the stewardship of adversity. What do you do with it when you're cut off from your family, your livelihood, your loved ones, your vocation? So he couldn't preach. Oh, he did. They came to the jail window and he preached. And then the magistrates tried to blockade it. They left a little slit at the top, and he climbed the wall and held himself up by his fingers and preached through the slit. I mean, I'm telling you, this was some kind of man. He was like the Apostle Paul. Also, we see in that word den or jail what a Christian should expect from this evil world. In other words, don't expect anything good from it. Peter said, don't think it a surprising thing when you're subjected to fire trials. Don't be surprised. But we are. We've tamed it down so much that nobody hates us anymore. So our choice when adversity comes is, will I be a complainer or a contributor? See, he was a contributor, not a complainer. Now, he took 2 books to jail with him. 2 books. See, we have too many books. He took a Bible, and he took Fox's Book of Martyrs. I cut my teeth on Fox's Book of Martyrs. I read it over and over again right after I was saved. I don't know how I even got to know about it. I read Fox's Book of Martyrs over and over again. There's another one on the market that's a sort of popularized modern paraphrase of that called Jesus Freaks. It's excellent. The more radical Christian youth are using it today as an echo of Fox's Book of Martyrs.
That's not the same book, though?
No.
Literally? I mean, I have that book, but I don't have this one.
Well, it's equally good,
Okay.
and it's easier to read than
Same
Fox's Book of
basis,
Martyrs.
though.
Yeah, same idea. So he says, I lighted on a certain place where it was a den, and if you have an annotated copy, you'll notice right beside that it says the jail. Now, that's Bunyan's note. And the scripture verses in the text are also inserted by the author, John Bunyan. In other words, they're not somebody's interpretation. But other notes that are in there are probably added to somebody else's interpretation. If you have such, and it's good to have one like that because it'll help you see some of these things. So it says, I lighted on a certain place where it was a den and laid me down in that place to sleep. In other words, I'm going to stay a while. And as I slept, I dreamed a dream. So he pictures getting this book through a vision. Now, write in your notes here somewhere the book of the minor prophet Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 2. Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 2. This is the verse that says, get the dream and write it down so that those who run may read it. And that's exactly what Bunyan does. He received this, quote, dream. He saw the vision of the whole Christian life laid out in front of him. In fact, it's actually his autobiography in allegorical form. You'll see, if you read his autobiography, you'll see this is the echo of his autobiography in picture form. And his conversion was a Pauline kind of conversion, with probably even more struggle than Paul had before his conversion. And so it echoes Christian experience as well as Christian truth. But Habakkuk 2:2, he said, as I slept, I dreamed a dream. I dreamed, and behold, I saw. Now here's the main character in the book described. He's not named yet. He's described. This is the person who becomes pilgrim or Christian. And there are several characteristics given you here immediately, and you don't want to miss any one of these. First, he's a man clothed with rags. So what condition is he in spiritually? All right, but what one word?
Lost.
Lost. He's a sinner in a most desperate way. Terrible sinner. And he's lost. Now, somewhere in your notes, put that word clothing is a key word, because biblically, all the way from Genesis 3 through Revelation 19, clothing is pictured as the symbol of man standing before God. And there are two kinds of clothing that picture that. One is rags, filthy rags. The other is linen. Filthy rags represent sin, and the linen represents the righteousness of Christ put on the person. So he's covered. If you're taking notes, you might want to jot down the references. Genesis 3, where God took off the fig leaves that they made, totally disregarded and rejected them, and provided animal skins, which means he killed the animals, the first sacrifice pictured, in order to provide a covering for them. Zechariah 3, high priest stands before God clothed with filthy garments, and he's told, they're told to take them off and clothe him in bright linen. Picture of the nation standing before God, filthy with sin. And God says, I will make you righteous if you will trust me. Another reference is Matthew 22. You'll recognize the story. Remember the story of the man who tried to get into the wedding feast. He got in, but he had no wedding garment on. And so he was rejected. Luke 15, first thing the Father said was, bring forth the best robe and put it on him. And the best robe is a whole wardrobe strategy. Go back and read the background of that. That was kept for the special, elegant guest. And here he gives it to his returning filthy son. Look in Paul's letters for the use of clothing. The last half of Ephesians and the last half of Colossians are devoted to putting off a certain kind of garment and putting on another, representative of spiritual reality. Revelation 19, the linen represents the righteousness of the saints. And this here couples that idea with Isaiah 64, verse 6, which says all of our righteousnesses, that's the best we can do, plural. All of our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. In other words, a man who approaches God alone is shaking a dirty mop in God's face and saying that's his hope of heaven. But it's worse than a dirty mop. I don't want to say it because we're on tape, even though there's no women here. If you realize what that term means in Isaiah 64:6, you can use your imagination. Filthy rags. That's the term that's used there. So, the first picture of this man is he's clothed with rags. It says, I saw a man clothed with rags standing in a certain place with his face, here's the second descriptive picture, with his face from his own house. So this shows his willingness to forsake everything. This man has been clamped by conviction. He's been shut up where he has no hope. He stands guilty before God, Romans 3:20. He has no hope unless he turns away from his present condition and finds a way out. And that turning his face away from his own house shows his willingness to forsake everything, Luke 14:33. Now, do not miss the next two phrases. There's a fourfold picture of this man in this one verse. First, he's clothed with rags. Second, his face is turned away from his own household and his own house. Here's the big factor. He has a book in his hand. And as a result of that book, he has a burden. He has a book in his hand, and as a result of that book, he has a great, and you have to really appreciate, a great burden on his back. Now, I have a picture of this painted or drawn by an artist, and it nowhere near represents this, because later on he tells us he was bent all the way down by this burden. This one shows him standing upright and elegant, holding the book firmly, and with the pack up there, just a little pack on his back. No, that's not what this is. This burden is the only thing in his life. Now listen carefully. The book is the burden builder. He has this burden because he's been reading this book. But the book also shows him the only way to the burden bearer. So the book is both his despair and his hope. Now ask a convicted sinner what the Bible does to him. It's his despair. Ask a converted sinner what the Bible does to him. It's his delight. So you see, you have both of these. It was that book. Every time he opened the book, the burden on his back got bigger and heavier. So the book, the first purpose of the book is the massive, radical conviction of the sinner. If that doesn't occur, you're wasting your time to offer him salvation. That's what bothers me about so much of what happens in our churches. We're offering to glib people who've never been convicted of their sins the right of making a decision is going to get them easily to heaven. It will never happen. God has to tear that person to shreds to save him. Because he doesn't know what he is. He doesn't know who he is. And this book says he is desperately wicked above everything. And only God knows that, and only God can show it to him. And he's clearly said it over and over again in his book. So this book is the burden builder before it can point to the burden bearer. Nobody will appreciate the burden bearer unless he realizes the massive size of the burden of his sins, and that those sins are like an anchor dragging him down toward hell. Let me give you an illustration. Roy Hession, who was one of the most insightful Christians I ever met, he said he was in Africa on a mission trip, and they were sitting around a campfire out in the bush, and black people and white people were giving their testimonies. And he said there was a chief of a tribe, an African, sitting around the fire, and he said he would never forget that man's testimony. He said his salvation started like this. He said, I had a dream, and apparently it was a literal dream, And he said, I saw myself walking on a path, and I saw a man up in front of me walking on the path, and he was bowed down to the earth, stumbling and staggering under a massive burden on his back. He said, I hurried to see if I could help him, and I got up there adjacent to him, abreast of him, and I leaned down to speak to him under the burden, and I recognized it was the face of Jesus. And I said to him, Lord, are you bearing the world's sins? And Jesus sadly answered, no, sir, just yours. See, one of the biggest problems, nobody at any point ever lays hold of God except by the handle of his sins. No sinner can lay hold of God except by the handle of his sins, because that's what has to be dealt with. And because there's so little, almost no preaching of law in our pulpits today, you're going to find out what that means in this book. You're going to get a massive picture of it in this book, because there's almost no presentation of law. We offer a grace that is very cheap, and thus the person is not broken in real conviction. I wish you could have lived through my conversion. I find echoes of Bunyan everywhere in my experience. When God convicted me of my sins, I thought I had suffocated. I could not raise my head. I couldn't breathe. I thought if the Hindus were right, there's 16 hells, I deserve number 17. And I could not breathe. And I knew there was no way for somebody like me to be saved. There was just no way. I feel like Spurgeon did. Spurgeon had, listen to this, Spurgeon read all of John Owen's massive Puritan commentaries and all of the works related to them before he was ever saved, and did not believe he could be saved. Because he was a Calvinist and he didn't believe he was an elect. And when God saved him, he saved him in the strangest, most peculiar ways, the simplest way possible. He just dismantled all of his unbelief, all of his doubt, and in the strangest, he wasn't prepared for it. That's the way God got to it. Same thing happened to me. Well, I mean, when God closed in on me, I'd known for 9 months I was lost. I didn't know everything that meant, but I knew I was in trouble. And I didn't know what guilt was. I just knew I was experiencing it badly. And I didn't know anything about the Bible. God closed, he put the burden on me and swelled it without any direct exposure to the message of the Bible. Now, listen carefully. Sinners discover their real condition and character only by exposure to and believing the message of the Scriptures. That means they may not be able to read the Bible themselves, but it has to be brought to them. And here's the reason only the Bible can do it. Sinners will always be deceived by their own flesh, by the world, and by the devil. Ephesians chapter 4. They're alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them, through the hardness of their hearts. Through the ignorance. So here's a paradox. The grief and self-alarm of sinners is increased each time they read and face the truth of the Bible, but true conviction makes them persist in reading anyway. Isn't that strange? Let me say that again. Here's the paradox. The grief and self-alarm of sinners is increased each time they read or are exposed to the truth of the Bible, but true conviction means they're going to keep on reading anyway, because they can't get away from it. That's when God is closed in on the person. It usually starts with them seeing Jesus in a Christian. And all over this book, when we get to Mr. Worldly Wise Man, Pilgrim, our Christian, will explain how he got the burden. And it's a great statement. Now, somewhere in your notes, put this phrase: read the minor prophets and search the phrase, the burden of the Lord. It's a big phrase in the minor prophets. Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Don't turn to it. Just put it
Search
in
the
your notes.
what?
Say that again?
And search the what?
All right, the minor prophets, the Old Testament, for the phrase, the burden of the Lord. Now, let me tell you what that burden is made up of. And not all of these are intended, I think, in the minor prophets, but in the Bible they are. The burden of the Lord, see, here's God's problem. He's looking for somebody to share his burden with him. But even the church won't listen. The church is too glib. It just enjoys itself. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying yourself, but God needs somebody to join him in carrying his burden. What is that burden? It's the burden of human depravity. Man's sinfulness. That is God's burden. Boy, is it a burden. I had a lady say to me one day, well, it looks to me like God ought to bear some responsibility since he created all this. I said, ma'am, the whole meaning of the cross is that God has assumed full responsibility for all of it. Human depravity is the burden of the Lord. Human frailty is the burden of the Lord. God made us as dust. And not even dirt. Dust. And the psalmist said, God remembers our frame and knows that we are only dust. Thank God for that. He carries this burden with and for us. He knows how weak we are, but he also knows how proud we are being so weak, and he realizes what would be true if it made us any stronger. Then the burden of the Lord is the burden of man's mortality, the fact that his life doesn't last long. He's going to die soon. In other words, how do I get through to a creature like this? Then there's the burden of immortality. He's going to live forever, though his life on this earth doesn't last long. So this is God's burden. What do you do when you made your signature of creation as man, and man is in this shape? That's the burden of the Lord, and God's not going to give up on him. God's burden is the burden of eternity. And that's the lifetime of God. That baffles us. Eternity is God's lifetime. But that puzzles us. We cannot imagine endless duration. And then there's the burden of destiny. Man is headed somewhere. And that's the burden of the Lord, because God's already been there. He knows about heaven and hell. We don't. We have to take somebody else's word for it. Now, did anyone catch when we read, anyone recognize in the term tinker anything that fits here? The tinker of his area was an itinerant, foot-walking tinker. So what did he have to carry with him? How big a burden?
All of his instruments, I guess, and tools.
And what's the biggest one? It's his anvil. He had to carry that anvil on his back. 60-pound anvil, research tells us. So he was familiar with extremely heavy burdens. And he put all these things together. Now, you'll want to write in your notes, I don't know whether I've got that in there anywhere or not, but Psalm, I think it's 38, verse 4. Somebody turn to that and read it. Psalm 38, verse 4. See, this man's sense of sin was huge, and it was heavy. It bent him down toward the ground, and he had to walk with that on him. That's his picture of sin and conviction. So Psalm 38, verse 4. Who's got it?
For my iniquities are gone over my head as a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me.
All right, there it is. Put that in your notes. Psalm 38, verse 4. My iniquities have gone over my head. They are, what's it say, a burden. They're too heavy for me. So this is the idea here. You see how biblical this man is? Every inflection is an echo of the Bible. So he's going to go ahead and we're going to run out of time real quickly. quickly, so let's move just a little bit. He says, he's given that fourfold description of this main character of the book up to this point. And then he says, I looked and saw him open the book and read therein. And as he read, he wept and trembled. And not being able longer to contain. In other words, no restraint can silence him within. And he can't contain himself. He's got to some way find a way to address this burden. He broke out with here's a key word, a lament. Book of Lamentations in the Bible is named after that word. He broke out with a lamentable cry, a mournful cry, saying, now this is the question of the day of Pentecost. Men and brethren, what shall we do? But you notice he puts an exclamation point after this. It's not a question. Now be careful to read these things very carefully. In other words, this is not a question. He's saying it's hopeless. There's nothing I can do. That's an exclamation point, not a question. What shall I do? Whatever I do is hopeless. This man is buried. That's true conviction. And notice the word he uses, in this plight. Therefore, now he thought he'd go home and be absorbed in the comforts of the domestic scene and could perhaps relieve his burden and forget it. He went home and restrained himself as long as he could. In other words, he kept silent as long as he could, that his wife and children should not perceive his distress. Now, mark this down devotionally. Silence is not a continuing option. Write this down. Silence is not a continuing option either in conviction or in conversion. In other words, when a person is truly convicted, he cannot keep it inside. It has to come out. That's the work of God. And when he's truly converted, he can't keep it inside. It's got to come out. And that's the reason it's so desperately inferior when a person says he makes a decision on Sunday morning, doesn't even come back to church on Sunday night. Something is terribly wrong with the atmosphere that allows that kind of thing to be called conversion. A conversion is a total turnaround where you not only are turned around, you make progress in the direction in which you turn, period. There's no other thing that could be called conversion. That's the very meaning of the word. This is far bigger than we have represented as being. We're much too glib about it. And we'll address why we're that way when we get into this book. So there are two things that cannot be kept silent. One is conviction. A person under conviction, as that grows on him, that burden increases, he cannot hide it. He cannot keep it. It will come out. And conversion. So silence is not a continuing option when a person is convicted of his sins or when he's converted to Christ. So he didn't want to say anything about it, that his wife and children should not perceive his distress, but he could not be silent long because that his trouble increased. No matter how he moved, the situation got worse. This guy is set up.
So are you saying here, right here, that the pilgrim got saved?
No.
Okay.
He's only under conviction.
He's only under conviction, okay.
See, here's the thing. Do you realize what would happen in a Puritan church in England if you walked down the aisle and said, I want to be saved? What would they tell you? They'd tell you, take a Bible, go home, live with it until you meet God. No decision's going to save you until you meet God. And then when they came back and said, have you been saved? Absolutely. Here's the next question. You ready for this? This will blow you away. They said, then would you go to hell for Jesus' sake? And Christians,
they'd ask that person.
absolutely. Would you be willing to go to hell for Jesus' sake? They built Christians in those days. In other words, this was something big and something real. It wasn't something you just go and kind of enjoy it Sunday by Sunday and get over it and things like that. I mean, gigantic, where God was all there is and all there was and all there ever will be, which is true whether we ever see it or not. And I'm not trying to make that a pressure on anybody. I'm saying that's the way it is. It becomes a pleasure. You'll see it when he gets there. Now, you'll know it when he gets saved. So he couldn't be silent long because his trouble increased. Wherefore, at length, he broke his mind to his wife and children. Now, be careful with this. Here's what happens when the natural man is exposed to a convicted sinner's real conviction. Thus he began to talk to them. "Oh, my dear wife," said he, "and you the children of my bowels, I, your dear friend, am in myself undone." That's an Isaiah word. "I'm in myself undone by reason of a burden that lies hard upon me. Moreover, I am certainly informed that this our city," he hasn't yet named it, but he will shortly. It's called the city of destruction. It represents a world under judgment. I remind you, Bunyan wrote this in 1675, and the Great Fire of London that burned the city down had occurred in 1666, just 9 years before. He saw the charred remains of the city of London. It actually was a mercy because it stayed the plague. It was killing thousands of Englishmen. But it burned the whole city down.
Brother Herb,